Hello and welcome to today's Now and Next podcast from Squire Patton Boggs. My name is Matthew Kirk. I'm International Affairs Advisor at Squire Patton Boggs, and I'm joined for this quick discussion of a huge subject, what can we expect in 2025, by my colleagues Paul Jones, like me, International Affairs Advisor, but based in the US, based in Washington, but currently in Cleveland. My colleague Mila Kasulka, who is partner in our public policy practice, also based in Washington, and Wolfgang Maschek, who heads our European public policy practice based in Brussels. Let's kick off without more ado, and clearly one of the major factors affecting the shape of 2025 is the new US administration, which will come formally into being in January, but we're already starting to see the shape of it. And Paul, I wonder if I could come to you first and just ask, what do the early appointments that we've seen in the new Trump administration tell us about President Trump's international policy looking forward to 2025?
Thank you so much, Matthew. Well, I think first, President Trump himself is doing some pre-inaugural signaling, as he sort of indicated in the campaign, that he's going to wield U.S. power unilaterally and boldly, especially through tariffs. There's some developments on whether Bob Lighthizer, it looks like the former U.S. Trade Representative, might not get a position, which may indicate some sort of dominance of those who believe tariffs should be used with some caution. But it's too early to tell. I think on other international outlooks, we see China hawks in the administration, Secretary of State designate Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, been tough on China. Strong support, I think you'll see from Israel and India, with supporters named already, like Mike Huckabee to be ambassador to Israel, Elise Stefanik, ambassador to the United Nations. Mike Waltz, the designate as the National Security Advisor, he co-chairs the India caucus in the House of Representatives, and then Secretary designate Marco Rubio, also very supportive of Israel and India. I think clearly he's signaled Ukraine-Russia engagement. Already appointed Keith Kellogg, former acting National Security Advisor under Trump, and a general who has written a long proposed peace plan. And I think despite that sort of clarity, there's going to be differences within his team, especially between sort of the internationalist interventionists like Rubio, maybe Waltz, and sort of the restrainers, those who think that U.S. should hold back a little bit internationally. But in the end, President Trump is going to call all the shots depending on how he sees them on any given day.
Thank you, Paul. And Wolfgang, how are the Europeans reacting? How are they looking at the Trump 2 administration as it takes shape?
Well, Messi, I think they're reacting differently than first time around. Certainly less of a surprise element here. I think Europeans and Europe's leaders have learned their lessons. They know that the Trump 2 administration is not a coincidence, but a symptom of a new geopolitical era in which we live in. Behind closed doors, obviously, many EU leaders deem the outcome of the election as problematic for the transatlantic relationship and for multilateralism overall. But I think instead of delivering word of caution and advice to Trump, as was the case back at the end of 2016, most leaders have now reached out and congratulated him. So it's a very different style and atmosphere. At the same time, Europe is preparing very closely for the various measures, economic policy measures, tariffs potentially, which Trump has hinted at during the election campaign. So I think Europe is also better prepared than last time around. It could move very quickly. There are various new legal instruments in place which weren't in place 7-8 years ago. I think also interestingly, we can see EU institutions such as the European Parliament building bridges to their counterparts in the US. So active outreach to the Senate, to the House of Representatives, in the understanding that while the Republican Party will have a majority in both chambers, some senators and congressmen might look very benign or more benign when it comes to the future EU-US policy agenda. And Trump can only act within limits without Congress. So I think they are hopeful that this bridge building and these personal relationships will matter. And that's also my last point. Personal relationships matter. So I think one learning also from the Trump 1 administration was how important it is to build up a rapport with him. And we can witness France has managed to get Trump to visit Paris in a couple of days to witness the reopening of the Notre Dame Church. So I think that's a reflection of the learnings of the Trump 1 administration.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang. Well, Mila, both Paul and Wolfgang mentioned tariffs, and we've already seen, of course, President-elect Trump starting to use tariffs in his foreign policy, and interestingly, using tariffs to secure non-trade objectives related to immigration and illegal drug traffic. There was a lot of talk during the campaign of a sort of generalized tariff approach. Do we think that's likely to be forthcoming? Are we expecting that? And if it comes to rebalancing trade, who will President Trump's major targets be?
I think the short answer, Ambassador Kirk, is yes. The use of tariffs for trade policy was a key foundational element of President Trump's economic platform more broadly. So we talk about universal tariffs, and when we talk about increasing tariffs on goods from China specifically, we just don't see those things not happening because of how central they were. And they really represent a broader dynamic, a shift in the United States on that economic policy, and how that plays into how the United States is approaching tax reform next year, how it plays into proposals such as efforts to devalue the US dollar, which are certainly much more complex than just that. They're all together. And I think we did have some clients reach out afterwards and say, hey, 10% China increase, that's not terrible. Well, that will not be the end of it, because I think as we all see, that was a foreign policy focused effort. And there are still a lot of complicated dynamics with the president and with Congress when it comes to the broader economic platform. And I think, there are a lot of questions like you just asked about what countries will be the focus. And I think really it's going to come to at the most simplest dynamic is going to be the deficits recorded. And so that's China, that's the European Union, but that's also important trading partners like Mexico, economies like Vietnam and Japan. It's really going to be a matter of those governments and as well as their businesses that are involved inside sitting down and saying, okay, this is the deficit. What are the deals that we can make? Because at his core, President Trump is a deal maker. On the question of sort of the team and sort of how those policies come together, the economic policy team is still coming together. I think, yes, Ambassador Lighthizer did not actually land anywhere, but, one of his former officials is actually going to be taking over as USTR. There are a lot of strong opinion about economic policies, and tariffs are one part of that broader debate. And so those things are going to continue to come together, and those teams are going to come together. And who has the president's ear the closest often will be the most influential. That's the case in any White House, but with this president in particular, it can be extremely pronounced. And then I just wanted to articulate as well, the president can only, as Ambassador Jones and Wolfgang have articulated, the president does have limits on what he can do when it comes to tariffs. But President Trump has shown in his first term that he will push those limits. And we expect that to not only continue, but increase. And so there are going to be a lot of discussions in Congress and among stakeholders about the use of those authorities. But again, with Republicans controlling both chambers of Congress, that dynamic is going to be really complicated, especially since in the House of Representatives in particular, that margin, we are talking 2 to 3 votes. And so there is not a lot of room for loss. But this is to say that in the first term, it was complicated, but it was sort of action, reaction, action, reaction. The playing field is much more complex now. There are going to be a lot more things happening quickly in Congress, at the White House, at the agencies that companies are going to need to respond to.
So a high-paced agenda again for a Trump presidency. Paul, if we look beyond the trade agenda, as I said, this early pre-presidential use of tariffs has been very much linked to non-trade policy objectives. What other foreign policy areas do you think President Trump might see tariffs as being useful in to try to achieve wider foreign policy objectives? I don't know, China, European defense expenditure, peace in the Middle East. There are all sorts of foreign policy objectives he could choose to pursue.
I think, obviously tariffs, as he said, many times publicly, are one of his favorite tools. So for himself, I think he will look to how to use it in all sorts of situations, and there really is no limit, as you indicated, to what he could apply. They're more effective in some situations than others, but I think as he after Inauguration Day, when he's with his entire team, I think you're going to see other members of the cabinet suggesting other tools to use for these various goals, foreign policy goals he has. And just to pick up on what Mila was saying, there are some limits to the big, bold use of tariffs, which he's already signaling. And I think he was testing some of those limits, even with his initial comments on tariffs toward Mexico, Canada, and China, testing the political reactions. What happens when I suggest this? He gets a certain political reaction. Also testing the financial markets, because it's uncharted territory when you go big and bold on tariffs, when it starts to actually have impact on the U.S. economy, on financial markets. And I think that's one reason why he has Secretary of Treasury designate Scott Bessent there, is to keep an eye on that, to make sure he doesn't, he judges a lot on how markets react, whether it's businesses, individuals, and I think he'll be very attentive to that. And also, as Mila indicated, Congress and the courts will play some restraining roles. And he's got a lot of other tools that other cabinet members will suggest, whether it's troop deployments, investment deals, nuclear technology, there's exports, controls, sanctions, a lot of tools he can use to accomplish these foreign policy objectives. But tariffs, will clearly be a key part of what he thinks of first.
And Wolfgang, you said earlier that the EU will be better prepared this time round than it was for the Trump 1 administration. How do you think the EU would respond to the imposition of Trump tariffs against the EU? What sorts of reactions would you see? Would the EU, perhaps in the same way as President Trump, see these as a way of opening up negotiations, or just as a more of a handling of a dispute?
Well, I think we're starting from a wait-and-see position. So right now, Brussels looks at what concretely is the Trump 2 administration going to do. Because one learning from the previous administration was that not everything which has been announced was then also implemented. So don't expect any radical moves at the EU level, certainly not proactive before Q1 next year at the earliest. Now, there's one interesting deadline coming up from a European perspective. You may recall the Trump 1 administration imposed tariffs on the import of steel and aluminum. The Europeans retaliated, and then these retaliation measures, they were suspended. Now, this suspension kind of comes to an end at the end of March next year. So it's going to be a natural point in time where Europe will be looking to discuss with their US counterparts how to deal with these trade restrictive measures. And if these measures would kick back in, you would have again increased tariffs on very iconic US products. Think of Harley-Davidson motorcycles, Zippo lighters, as well as measures which will target particularly those regions which in the past have traditionally supported Trump. Now, also kind of picking up what Paul said before, I mean, it's very clear to everyone in Brussels that a trade war with the US will have very severe negative economic consequences for Europe and for the US and others. And that's certainly not something Europe is looking for, given its low level of growth currently. But Europe will certainly be looking at the bigger picture and try to understand, as your question alluded to, Matthew, what's the specific objective of the Trump administration when it comes to a proposed trade measure? In order to calibrate the potential responses from the European side and potentially come up with a deal. Trump is a transactionally minded US president after all, so Europeans will certainly kind of not forget that. And as we talked about before, the US might want Europe to support in a more strict fashion its China policy, one area. Another one is an area you alluded to, Matthew. Europe needs to invest more in its defense capabilities. That's understood. There is certainly room for negotiation here on that front, because Europe can turn to its own market to purchase the necessary equipment and weaponry. It can turn to the US, or it can turn elsewhere. Third area might be energy security, purchase of US LNG gas. something which Ursula von der Leyen has already hinted at, might be one area in which the Europeans show flexibility up front to create that goodwill, which hopefully Trump will pick up on.
Thank you, Wolfgang. And Mila, we saw an interesting intervention by President-elect Trump the other day, which potentially broadened the trade agenda a bit, which was a warning to the BRICS countries not to try to undermine the role of the US dollar as the sort of global reserve currency. Is that part of the overall trade agenda? Is it something different to it? How does this fit in?
I think how it fits in is also very much the dynamics that Paul described, that a little bit of the testing of the waters of the use of tariffs for a bit of a broader brush than just reducing the trade deficit. I do think that also, and I think Paul, you suggested this as well, there is this potential dynamic shift, maybe slight, maybe more significant, about using tariffs more and using sanctions a little bit less, and how tariffs can play that same role in developing leverage and building economic pressures. But I think also, and I will just say that we also want to remember how he works and how often posts and things are responsive to what the people around him are saying, what he's seen on the news, and how he's reacting. And so I don't think that this specific proposal was a key part of his campaign platform, but it's an example of how those ideas sort of develop and are articulated, and then how the world reacts to them. So I think that's the dynamic that we all really need to take away from it, that these sorts of actions, proposals, policies are going to continue to pop up like this, and they're not just going to come out in official press releases from the White House, but they're going to come out in these social media posts, and it's really going to be about businesses trying to decipher what we call the signal from the noise and figuring out where the real risks are, the opportunities are, and where their opportunities to influence and provide inputs and get to the people around Trump and develop sort of that stakeholder support in opposition to or in support of certain policies. So I wouldn't say that this was something that he was on the campaign trail pushing for, but it's sort of an example of the kinds of things we're going to be seeing.
Thank you, Mila. And we're going to move on from tariffs a bit now. But before we do, there's a question in from Matthew Giles about whether we should expect countries who are made subject to tariffs to retaliate by imposing their own on US supplies. And I think certainly, I mean, Wolfgang, you've said in the case of the EU, the answer to that is yes. I would imagine the answer is yes in the case of China as well. I think for smaller countries, and I include the UK in that, there may be more of a balance, and certainly in the UK, I detect a bit of a debate going on about whether to inflict additional cost on UK consumers by imposing tariffs, or whether actually to try to ride the tariffs and reach an accommodation with President Trump on whatever issues he wants to pursue through tariffs. So there may be a bit of variation from country to country in that, Matthew, but I would say clearly the major trading blocs, China and the EU, are very, very likely to retaliate. But Wolfgang, I wanted to, as I said, to look a bit beyond the trade agenda and to ask, do you think, how united do you think Europe is in its approach to some of the key President Trump issues? Clearly, Russia-Ukraine is going to be very high on his agenda. And we've already seen, as Paul said, the appointment of General Kellogg as his Ukraine envoy with a clear remit to try to bring that conflict to an end as rapidly as possible. We've mentioned European defense spending, and obviously that relates to the relationship in NATO and the transatlantic alliance and so forth. How united do you think Europe will be in its approach to these key strategic issues?
Well, Matthew, that's a challenging question for someone sitting in Brussels, because in particular on these foreign policy topics, on these hot geopolitical items, Europe still is a confederation of 27 member states. We require unanimity in our decisions when it comes to foreign policy matters. So you see a lot of divergence with regards to China, but also with regards to the position on the war in the Ukraine. That's also because European countries are affected very differently by the war in the Ukraine, based on their geographical location, historical ties, or overall the geopolitical interests and powers, which makes it unfortunately easy for any large power, be that Russia or China or also for the US, to play off the European Union member states against each other in these discussions, despite the fact that most EU member states are also members of NATO. But having said this, I think the European institutional leadership certainly has clarified repeatedly that they will continue to support Ukraine with whatever it takes in order for the Ukraine to prevail in that conflict. And you've also seen that the incoming EU Commission, which is just in its new job now for a couple of days, has a completely revamped and beefed up focus on defense. So for the first time in history, we have a commissioner and director general focused on defense only, and the new commissioner, Lithuanian Kubilius, should bring the new EU Defense Union to life. And now really all eyes in Brussels and probably also globally are on him to see how he will deliver on this mandate.
And Paul, remaining on the European theme, you spent a good part of your diplomatic career in Europe. You're well familiar with how the US looks from this side of the pond. Do you think the Trump II administration poses wider strategic challenges to Europe? For example, defense policy and NATO, Europe's relationship with China and economic dependence in certain areas on China. And obviously we have the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the European position on that. How do you think, and I should say President Trump is not a noted enthusiast for the European Union. How do you think the Trump II administration will look at its relationships with Europe?
I think it's going to be very challenging. And actually, I think that Trump 2.0, as we describe it, could be as impactful for the transatlantic relationship as Trump 1.0 was for the US-China relationship. And it goes to the things that you've mentioned and we've mentioned during the call. President-elect Trump sees the EU as an adversarial trading bloc, and he sees NATO as sort of an encumbrance that, I'm not saying that there will be a drastic change in US approach to NATO, but it's not a priority. And I think in general, irrespective of President Trump, you see in the US body politic a shift into seeing Europe as a secondary theater of strategic attention for the United States, with Asia and China being the primary theater. And to put it sort of crudely, that the role of Europe is to take care of its own business more, which is a sharp departure from sort of the US-European relationship of the past, and to support the United States on China and Asia. And so I think that sort of sets up some natural tensions in how both sides of the Atlantic will look. And I think Trump will accelerate these trends. We've spoken about the trade issues that may come up that I think will likely come up between the US and the EU. As you mentioned, I think Trump will probably, my guess would be he will go along with calls, particularly from the Poles and some other countries, to raise significantly the expected spending levels of NATO members from 2% to 2.5% or 3%, which would put some of the bigger NATO countries under enormous strain to achieve that. And if there are retributions, if not further strain, especially in tariffs, due to the economic and political, weaknesses now in some European countries, I think he could negotiate with Putin and Zelensky over Ukraine without very much consulting European leaders, which would be a tremendous blow to the transatlantic relationship. So I think there's a lot of potential for change ahead, and it really merits close monitoring.
Thank you, Paul. And Mila, one area we've alluded to a couple of times through this conversation is energy policy. And clearly, during the campaign, President Trump was very explicit that he wanted to see Americans paying lower energy prices. He wanted to use that as a way of correcting some of the cost of living pressures that that the American public have suffered in recent years. But do you think the Trump energy policy goes beyond that? Is it just about domestic energy supply and stimulating growth in the US economy? Or do you think that energy policy also has a role to play as part of the Trump 2 administration foreign policy?
I think most certainly yes. And I think even not just about stimulating growth and reducing U.S. prices, but also addressing trade deficits. I think Wolfgang, you flagged, LNG exports are going to play an extremely important role for different countries that are seeking to bring something to the table to help address those imbalances. And we've all been watching very closely in the United States and globally the freeze on LNG exports. And that freeze, even though it was challenged in court, we expect that freeze, I believe President Trump has already said, will be lifted. And so it will be an important foreign policy and international economic policy tool, particularly in offering alternatives to other sources. But I think in the United States, the energy debate is wrapped up in a much broader issues that foreign stakeholders are also going to be interested in. It is not going to be an either or with alternative and clean energy sources. So the idea of foreign companies investing in the United States, building out technology, manufacturing jobs, I think that's going to be something that, especially in Congress, there's going to be a lot of debate and consideration of, especially surrounding certain tax credits and programs that may be up for debate as part of tax reform next year. But I think there is a pretty strong base of support in Congress for clean energy manufacturing in the United States as an America first kind of policy. But I believe Ambassador Jones pointed out too, nuclear is having a nuclear policy, pro-nuclear policy is having a resurgence in the United States. And there is going to be also that opportunity for international cooperation and as support to build out, particularly as energy supports next generation technologies. The energy for data centers, energy and AI, those things are very much linked in the policy debates in the United States. And things like permitting reform and LNG exports and all the things that we're talking about in sort of promoting energy exports, promoting energy development in the United States, those are all going to be priorities for Republicans in Congress as well.
Thank you, Mila. And the three of you have been brilliant at keeping your answers very crisp, and we've covered a huge amount of ground in a very short time. I said at the top of the webinar that we were going to try and keep to a half hour, and that's what we're going to do. I think we've just got time to sneak in a parting thought from each of you. So Paul, let's start with you.
Oh, well, I think we're entering a pretty risky period for throughout the world as political leaders are testing the limits, or testing actually on the economic and military battlefields how far they can go with a wider breadth of tools at their disposal. And so I think it's far beyond Trump to be looking at new ways of influencing great powers and powers throughout the world. But I think he'll accelerate that trend. So I think I think we're in for quite a ride in the years ahead.
And Wolfgang?
Well, I think despite all the challenges we also have kind of today uncovered and talked about, I think Europe might ultimately benefit from the incoming Trump 2 administration. That's because Europe takes its decisions in a very complicated fashion, often moves only very slowly, unless there's an external stimulus, a challenge. And Trump 2 is certainly a challenge for Europe. I think Christine Lagarde, the president of the European Central Bank, said recently Trump might be the reform accelerator Europe needs. And I think there's some truth in that. And so maybe the Trump 2 administration comes in just the right time for Europe.
Brilliant. Mila?
I'm just going to echo what I said earlier, that I think the first Trump administration kept us all on our toes. We were all busy. Things were moving very quickly. But the dynamic, the playing field, the economic priorities, they're all so much more complicated now. And they're going to overlap and interplay. And so the playing field is just going to be a lot more complicated, if you can believe it. And I do think is going to move faster. So.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for listening. We're going to draw it to a close now. I will end with what I think is the best commentary that I've seen addressed out of the US to the Europeans, which is the problem with you Europeans is you take Trump literally but not seriously, whereas the Americans take him seriously but not literally. And there's a bit of a debate about whether symbolically should feature somewhere in that set of adjectives as well. But thank you all very much for being with us. If you want to be in touch with any of us, or indeed we have a large team in Washington who are analyzing closely what to expect from the incoming Trump administration, do please reach out to us. We'd be delighted to hear from you. Thank you very much for listening to us, and have a very good day.